Good evening, and thanks for joining us. Now, some of you are members of the public who may not have been at the opening a few minutes ago. So I will start again and say I'm Tina Oldknow, the curator of Modern Glass, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Michael Rogers. But before I introduce Michael, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the exhibition that opened to the members this evening and which opens to the public tomorrow. That always happens when I'm speaking. That is called Curiosities of Glassmaking. This exhibition is in the museum's West Bridge, and it runs until October 21st. Curiosities of Glassmaking is the result of months spent looking through the museum's storerooms and study gallery. And even though I am one of the curators, I was still surprised by the richness of the museum's collection and how glass can be used in so many different ways. It's an incredibly versatile material. The idea for the exhibition was inspired by the cabinets of curiosities, or wonder rooms, Wunderkammer, that became popular in Europe in the 17th century. This type of collecting reached its height in the Victorian period. A typical inventory of a cabinet of curiosities, which you can see in this slide, might include paintings, trophy animals, unusual insects, archaeological artifacts, skeletons, geological specimens, horns, tusks, and scientific instruments. The museum's exhibition of curiosities includes similar things, but all made of glass. One of the most fascinating pieces in the exhibition is called The Murmur of the Bees, and it was made by tonight's speaker, Michael Rogers. You can see a detail of this piece on the slide. Throughout his career, Michael has admired and been inspired by the life work of Leopold and Rudolf Blaschke, the Bohemian father and son lamp workers who used glass to create thousands of scientifically accurate botanical specimens and invertebrates. As many of you know, the Blaschkes and their amazing models will be the subject of this summer's main exhibition, Botanical Wonders: The Story of the Harvard Glass Flowers, which opens on May 18th. After acquiring a display case that was once used in the exhibition of the Blaschke's glass flowers at Harvard's Peabody Museum, Michael decided to make a work about the natural world in honor of the artists. In The Murmur of the Bees, which you will see in the exhibition upstairs, Michael engraved and then painted images of bees and their anatomy, copied from 19th century Victorian illustrations, on the glass of the antique display case. On the inside of the case, white cotton, which is quilted in the form of a honeycomb by Michael's wife, Betty, reflects the shadows cast by the engraved bee images. Inside are 5 silver bees that were cast from actual bees. The effect of the piece is that of a busy, yet silent, somewhat ghostly hive. Michael is currently professor and head of the glass program at the School for American Crafts of the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT. Prior to moving up the road, he spent 11 years in Japan, where he was head of the glass department at the Aichi University of Education near Nagoya. In 1998, he was co-chair of the Glass Art Society Conference in Saito, Japan, and he has also served as a board member and as past president of the Glass Art Society. In 2004, the museum acquired one of his sculptures, 13 Crows, which you can see in the sculpture gallery. What impresses me about Michael's artwork is his investigation and presentation of esoteric ideas and theories that are not only difficult to represent visually, but are also hard to define. His work has a pronounced literary character, which reflects his interest in language and the complex process of describing thought and feeling. Symbols in the forms of words and found objects appear throughout his work, as do ideas about transmission and transparency, for which glass is a perfect conduit. Michael enjoys intellectual challenges, and in his work, he never takes the easy way out. He says, quote, "I am interested in artists whose commitment to ideas has led them to the use of glass. I am most concerned with what animating force or personal impetus draws artists to glass, and ultimately what glass can draw from the individual." Please welcome Michael Rogers.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be here. I remember my first trip to Corning was in 1983, soon after I'd graduated from graduate school. And I can't really express how much the museum's collections had opened my eyes to a whole new world of thought and ideas and visual images. And it's just such a great honor, because I'd never dreamed at that point that I might someday actually be speaking in this grand museum. So thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to go ahead with the slides now, and if the screen can become activated here, I will begin. Touch screen to activate. Okay. All right, so I will just begin. And I like to start out my lectures with these two images. It's of Gustav Mahler, who he's in France. He's at the age of 87, and he was referred to as the Icarus of this particular area. And one of the things I love about Gustav is just the spirit of what these images indicate, this idea that one can do the impossible. I'm very interested in what I might call a kind of idea of hopeless optimism. That is that even though people will try to convince you that things are impossible, that you keep doing them anyway because you think someday it just might work out. And even though Gustav had never probably left the ground for maybe a couple of seconds or a couple of inches off the ground at a time, he believed he could fly, and he was quite the inventor as well. So I know that, I believe that also I was fortunate enough to go to Solvin Park and meet some of the scientists here a couple of years ago. And I think that spirit of invention and kind of believing that the impossible can be accomplished is still very much alive here today. I believe that place is very important. It's very important to know where you've come from, and I think it has so much to do with who you are. And I originally came from a small town called Wyoming, Illinois, which is somewhere in between Peoria and Kewaunee, if you've ever heard of those two cities. But I'm very much someone who has come from this area of a vast horizon and wide open spaces, and in some ways there's a kind of desolate, lonely feeling, but incredibly beautiful, I think, kind of effect one gets from the landscape of these areas. Now, after I'd gone to school, Western Illinois University, and then to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, where I got my graduate degree, my wife Betty and I had moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where I was a technical assistant at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I think I worked about a year and a half with another artist there until I got that position. I worked 1 week and they went on strike. And I just was in so much debt that I had to move back to my home area where I could find a job. And I actually, Betty and I moved south of Chicago, outside a small town called Beecher, Illinois. This is Route 1 heading towards Kankakee. And that old barn, which I would have loved to have saved, actually I had to tear down, and that became the site of my studio. But we spent 10 really quite wonderful years there, where I worked as an independent artist eventually in my own studio after working in the mills. And after I had my studio running, and I had several exhibitions I was preparing for, and I was given a call asking me if I'd be interested in teaching in Japan. And I said, yes, of course, that sounds interesting. And I put down the phone, thought I'd never hear from this person again, but I did. And then I said to my wife, Betty, I said, how would you like to move to Japan and live in Japan and work and teach there? And she said, well, that sounds interesting. And I thought that to be yes. So I accepted the position. It all happened very fast. And then I said, Betty, we're going to Japan. She goes, what? And I said, well, but dear, you said that sounded very interesting. And she said, well, that means we were going to discuss it. And then I turned down the job, and then we had more discussions, and then I accepted it again the day later. But we ended up going from the prairies, this kind of infinite flatness of the landscape in Illinois, to Japan, which is a very mountainous country. And I had always wanted to live in a different country and learn their language and assimilate their culture. My oldest brother went to Taiwan, and he was in the Air Force, and he came back with a Taiwanese wife, and he was speaking Mandarin Chinese, and had mastered a martial art, and it was a big influence on me. And so I always wanted to go somewhere else outside of Wyoming, Illinois, further than Peoria, or perhaps even Kewaunee. This is Insato, near Nagoya in Japan, and it has a 5,000-year history of ceramics production in that area. And at one time, 70% of all the material for making glass in Japan came from this area. My studio was out in this area. It was near Kaisho Forest, and this is where we had the Glass Art Society conference in this area, not exactly this spot. And another thing that I found incredibly interesting about Japan was its history, to be surrounded by these incredible castles, and I think that's Nagoya Castle, and also on your left is an image of from Sanju-san Gendo in Kyoto, which means like 33,000 images of Buddha, and they're all hand-carved, and they all have a little bit different expression. And I remember when I first went to the university, and there's a small Shinto shrine there, and I asked the ceramics professor, I said, well, how old is this shrine? He says, not very old. He says it was built in the 1700s, which, old for me was a barn that was maybe 100 years old. So it really had given me a different perspective on history. Also, Japan is so fascinating in terms of the contrast between the very old and the very new. On my way to Sato, I would stop in Toyota, where the cars are made, and they have this incredible art museum, the Toyota Contemporary Art Museum, where I had exhibited before, and it's just a very beautiful piece of contemporary architecture. And then also right next to it, they would have a tea house and have tea ceremony. So there's this kind of feeling of the old and the new coming together. This is an installation I did in Nagoya at a gallery called Gallery Planet. And there's this concrete stairwell that goes all the way up. On your left, you can see the bottles, cast glass bottles, which is actually, each one has a word engraved on it, and altogether you can read it somewhat like a poem. You can see on either side of the hallway going up the stairs, perhaps a little hard to see, but are the crows. That was the first time that they were exhibited. And they're hanging on the walls there, and then there are puddles of glass that you can see perhaps somewhat bending over the stairs coming down. And I was very interested in creating an entrance into my exhibit, which is at the top of these stairs, but also creating a kind of space of transformation that those puddles of glass, which are cool, actually look like they're moving. So you begin to feel like perhaps anything could happen in this space. There's a close-up of the crows. And I guess I'll tell you a little bit about this piece because I'm so proud to have it here in this museum. And it's a piece that came from, none of my ideas necessarily come from one particular place. It's kind of a culmination of different ideas that I happen to be thinking of at one time, something I perhaps am reading, something I'm looking at and am interested in, and then a piece begins to come together rather intuitively. And in Japan, in the rice fields that they will hang effigies of crows upside down in the fields, and this is to keep other crows out. So in a sense, it's a kind of a warning. And I laminated Japanese newspaper around it. And I don't want to explain too much about the piece, but I think we all have this feeling sometimes. Every once in a while, I have to take a hiatus from reading the newspaper. And I believe we live in very interesting, quite wonderful times, but also troubling times as well. And this piece is something, to me personally, symbolizes just having an awareness of what's going on around us, confronting the things that, even the bad news as well as the good news. I work with found objects, and these are actually coat hangers, and they would have hung with school uniforms draped over them in a store window in Japan. And you can see where the sun has affected and darkened part of them. And I'd never worn a uniform going to school, and teaching in Japan is quite different from teaching here. And this particular piece is called gakusei, which means students. And they're cast glass lenses, and there's forged steel text behind them. So the kind of bust of these figures acts as a kind of magnifying glass or lens for the text behind them. Now, it's all in Japanese, and it took me years to get to the point where I felt like I could work visually and address a Japanese audience. Ironically, this piece took so long that by the time I exhibited it for the first time, it was in Richmond, Virginia. So there was no attempt to be obscure with the text. I actually had taken almost like a cut and paste of sections of a Japanese assistant's childhood theme papers, and they were on the themes of war and bullying, or ijime in Japan. It's a big issue there. I think it's a big issue in the United States in our schools as well, but also what I would like to do in the future. And they seem to still be things that our students are thinking about today in some way. And so this was, I think, about teaching in Japan in some ways. This is a quite large casting based on Italian votive motifs. Now, these would have been effigies that are hung in the altars of Catholic churches. If there was some problem or a medical problem, you might hang one of these effigies in the altar of the church, and as a kind of prayer and hoping that you would get better. And I'm very interested in any kinds of rituals that involve hope and faith. This particular piece on your right is called In the Wake, and it was first shown in the Toyota Museum, and then just this last year again recreated in the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester. And each one of these bottles is engraved all the way around with text from Finnegan's Wake. And in the wake refers to being in the wake of somebody really great. And I would feel like when I'm reading James Joyce, and I can't pretend to understand all of Finnegan's Wake, but I love reading it. And there's something very, there's a certain cadence to it, and I believe the way he put words together are somewhat similar to the way we put artists put objects together. You put, one object next to another object and next to another one, and it becomes a kind of new invention in terms of the way these objects interplay and off each other. And I wanted to, also at the Toyota Museum, there were the works and vitrines of Joseph Beuys, and he was very influenced by Joyce as well. And there's actually, just in an odd way, our neighbors who lived in the apartment below us in Japan, a Japanese man who taught at the university was a James Joyce scholar, and he showed this slide at a James Joyce convention in Switzerland, and a curator from Dublin had contacted me. It took her 2 years to find me, but she did, and then she included several of the bottles from this work in an exhibition on art inspired by James Joyce at the Royal Hibernian Academy in Dublin. What we have here on your right is a work by an artist from the Hans. It's one of Hans Prinzhorn's collection. One of patients, actually. Hans Prinzhorn was a pre-World War II psychiatrist who had amassed over 5,000 drawings of what they call the insane, And Emma Hawke had written over and over again, "Sweetheart, come," and so many times that the language kind of obliterated the language, and this elicited great empathy from me. And I believe the power of visual image, there's great power for visual imagery or art or music of literature of any kind to elicit empathy from people, and I believe that that's perhaps one of the most valuable aspects of the medium. On your left is a witch bottle, and it was found in I think it was found around in the early 1800s, but was probably put there long before, but it was found in a chimney in England. And there's fluid on the interior, and there's bent nails, but there's this interest in bottles as being containers of powerful and invisible forces, and that interested me a great deal as well, and was an influence on some of these later pieces that I've done. So I'm blowing glass, I'm casting glass. The piece on your right is a cast glass figure that's set inside this vessel, and then there's engraving around it, and that's titled Sea of Words. It's just somehow how I feel when I'm reading. I think we all get lost in books, and we can be reading and somebody's talking to us and we don't hear what they're saying. And also on the left is a bottle inside a bottle inside a bottle, and there's a clock, pocket watch on the interior, and it's sitting on a magnet with iron filings around it. And I'm interested in stopped watches. I'm interested in time. I think that it's good to be aware of time. I think each moment we have is incredibly precious. I try to remind myself of that constantly. So I make this work intuitively, but for me it symbolizes something like that. I had also kind of come across the word palimpsest, which is a kind of document, I think pre-paper, kind of a perhaps animal skin, in which was used almost like a blackboard. I'd read in the newspaper they had found Archimedes' palimpsest, and I thought, what is a palimpsest? And anyway, you whitewash this animal skin and you write on it. Then you whitewash over the writing, you turn it and write on it again. And with new imaging techniques, you can read the writing behind the writing behind the writing and gain valuable historical scientific information from such documents. Now, just as an idea for making art and involving glass, you can see how you can read the writing on, from one bottle to the next. And it's somewhat how I feel about reading, as how the words start to wash over the words. You remember what you've read, you anticipate what you're going to read, and you know what you're reading at the moment, and it all blends together. Kind of a test tube shape. What you see on the bottom is solid glass and then blown glass on top. It's attached together. There's a cast glass head in the center set on top of a magnet with iron filings and steel letters. This is actually kind of a drunken bottle, and it refers to a famous pub crawl in Ulysses by James Joyce. And this was a sort of self-portrait in a way. There's wadded up text from my favorite books, and that all goes into a funnel that's kind of going into my head. I don't know if we can get this to focus a little bit or not. The picture on the right is myself and several works that I'd made over a 2-week period in Riga in Latvia. And I tend to travel a lot, and travel's important to me. And I first met my Latvian friends at a symposium in Lviv in the Ukraine. And I've been to Riga twice, and there's a picture of the city and the Daugava River beyond. And I look forward to going there again next October and meeting my friends, and then perhaps going to Estonia and then to the Ukraine to a symposium again. This is the Art Academy in Riga, and on your left you see on the corner is a 18th century German merchant's house called the Menzendorf House that's turned into a museum. And I have a little room that they allow me to keep in the attic, and then their studio is in this kind of catacomb-like basement, and I get to wander the halls of this empty museum on my way down to the studio in the evenings. And this past September I had exhibited at the Museum of Decorative and Applied Arts, which is just a block away from there. But it's a very beautiful city if you ever get a chance to visit it. These are some cast glass pieces. This particular figure you can see on the left, where the hands are just above the surface of the glass, and there's text on the glass. And I'm very interested in this idea of evoking images. There's actually a history and tradition of evoking images from reflective surfaces, whether that be a crystal ball or the bottom of a teacup, or the Shakers used to hold up a white sheet, and then people would look into that, and I believe that the subconscious imagery would kind of come to the forefront. And this was the exhibition at the Memorial Art Gallery. And on the left is one of my pieces titled Neruda Bottle. and I've engraved on it text from Neruda's Book of Questions. There's a cast glass rabbit holding a key sitting on top of a magnet bed on the inside. And this is the Murmur of Bees, and my family kept bees. My parents both went through the Depression, and in a small town during that time, there really wasn't work and there really wasn't money, but if you had land, you would make huge gardens, and my grandfather made wine and had orchards and these gardens, and he also kept bees, and most of my family did, except I was the youngest, and by that time, the beehives were just kind of left, and the bees still inhabited them, but nobody really took care of them. But I used to pore through these books as a child and was just fascinated by them. The story behind this is actually, I was, towards the end of my stay in Japan, I'd taken about 9 months, and I was a sabbatical replacement for Ruth King at Ohio State University. And during that time, I went to visit a very good friend, Susan Rossi Wilcox, who's the curator of the Blaschka collection at the Peabody Museum, at the Harvard Natural History Museum. And she's giving me this wonderful tour of the museum, and down in the museum I see Vladimir Nabokov's butterfly collection case inside another case. So there's already a very palimpsestic idea, and I'm very excited and getting ideas for making work. I didn't really realize that Nabokov was not only, this incredible author, but he is also known in the scientific field for his contributions to the study of the blue morph butterfly. And then she had showed me these cases up in the attic and all the other curious things in the attic. And she said, well, these housed the Blaschka flowers, and I think for some reason they were taking some of the pieces off the main display floor, and these cases were no longer needed, and they were going to throw them out. But she couldn't bear to see them go, so she had them taken to the attic. She says, I don't know what to do with them, so being the practical man that I am, I said, I'll take them all. I'm going back to Japan in 2 months. I have 6 of these. They're huge, and I went back to Ohio. I couldn't wait. I had bought another display case, as if the 6 that I had weren't enough. I couldn't get them soon enough, so I bought one, and I made a piece, which I'll show you. But I became very interested in what was housed inside these cases, and if these cases could talk, they would talk to you of what had inhabited them. And I started to engrave this bee anatomy around this case, and it took kind of forever. Each little image might have taken about an hour and a half, 2 hours to make, and then I decided that I really needed something to cover it, and my lovely wife was really wonderful to make this quilt for the inside. And I had actually planned on putting some cast glass crows that have a kind of beeswax pattern, almost like bandages around them on the inside of the case. And that was the plan until I carried it outside and I saw the light go through this case and project perfect images of these engravings on the surface of the quilt. And so I decided how wonderful if these cases just housed ephemera, something that's kind of there and not there, such as a shadow. And I got to thinking about how objects can kind of speak to us, and not in a loud voice, but more in a kind of whisper or perhaps a murmur. And so that's sort of how this case developed, and very intuitively. And I actually had just received, not too long ago, I decided it needed just something else. And I had a jeweler in Latvia take molds off of real bees and then cast them in silver. This case is engraved with text from Vladimir Nabokov's The Gift. And in the lenses on the top of the shelf are images, sectional images of the blue morph butterfly. There's a pocket watch with an engraved face hanging from the top shelf on the left. And the typewriter has about 16 feet of text typed dry, embossed into the wax paper. And I was thinking almost like a kind of automatic writing. If Nabokov could speak now, that perhaps this might be the way he would do it. And this is the last piece I have to show you today, I believe. It's entitled Flock, and it takes about wall space about 20 foot by 20 foot, and it's about 3 inches thick of cast glass images of Victorian picture frames. And there's swallows in flight that are engraved on the back of the glass. And for me, it's as simple as taking a walk in the country and seeing these incredible barn swallows flying around, oftentimes near barns, and just how beautiful that is, and evoking that imagery, kind of allowing that memory to come back. But thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. We do have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. If there's anyone who would like to ask Michael about his work.
There's Rob in the back.
Hi, okay, yes, Rob.
Yes. Rob had asked me about the engraving of the text and how I accomplish that on the surface of the pieces. I use it's almost about the size of a magic marker, and you stick in a little diamond bit, and it just rotates. And I can write better with that than I can with a pencil. And I just will oftentimes sit with a piece in my lap and turn it and write and turn it and write. And with the cases, I'll sometimes put images behind the glass and engrave over them and interpret those drawings in that way. The crows are done in a lost wax casting process. So it's very similar to bronze casting, lost wax bronze casting, only with glass molds you put them in an oven and you put the glass in cold sometimes. That's the way I do it. I bring the oven up to temperature to about 1700 degrees. The glass will begin to flow into the negative inside the mold, and then I'll open up the door and add more glass until it's full. And then depending on the thickness of the glass with the crows, it'll stay in the oven for about a week and a half, going through subtle temperature changes until it is annealed and reaches room temperature. And then there's some grinding of the excess glass and finishing work and laminating of the newspaper, and sometimes I rub in colored pigments afterwards. Well, I am happy to say I do have a fantastic studio now, and it's larger than our house. which it's a great space. And I was lucky enough to, at this stage, work with an architect. And so it has a kind of tower section to it, an area with a library, a place to draw and to think. It's about 2,000 square foot. And I have casting equipment and grinding and polishing equipment. I have welding equipment. It's kind of a multimedia sculptor's studio. And I have to say that in many ways, because I'm teaching at RIT and I love working with the students, when I come to my own studio, I prefer to work by myself. But there are sometimes students who will want to have independent studies with me. They want to learn about the casting process. And one day a week, if they're interested, I will open up my studio to them and involve them in my processes so that they can learn what I do. And so sometimes I have assistants, sometimes I don't. I have two great assistants here tonight, Jeremy and David, and they're working with me on a collaborative project with the senior professor in ceramics, Richard Hirsch. And so we had gone to the Pittsburgh Glass Center and blown glass there and made clay work at a clay studio not far from the center there, brought the pieces back to my studio and are assembling them at school and at my studio, and then we'll show them actually at the Clark Gallery in Boston on April 7th. So that's what I'll do when I go back home. Mm-hmm.